On the southern tip of Vancouver Island, Victoria stands as the shining jewel of Canada's Pacific coast. Blessed with a temperate climate, breathtaking natural beauty, and a fascinating history, the city brings in visitors from near and far. This short video will outline the early settlement and urban development in Victoria's downtown core through illustrations, photographs, and video, tracing the history of development from the first use of land by Indigenous populations to the booms of colonial settlement and building construction in the 1910s and 1920s. Section 1. The Land and Early Indigenous Development. Long before the arrival of Europeans, this land was home to the Lekwungen people, also known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations, part of the Coast Salish community. Archaeological evidence suggests that Indigenous communities have called this region home for over 13,000 years, first arriving when ice still covered the globe. The Indigenous communities who lived on the south of Vancouver Island built longhouses and lived in tents. These settlements were often temporary as communities moved with changing seasons. This was the extent of Indigenous development on the land. It was a reciprocal and relational partnership between people and nature. Newer forms of development would only occur as external influence would begin to control how the land in this region was used. This change started in 1778, when the first Europeans set foot on Vancouver Island. Captain James Cook sailed north from the Oregon coast in his travels across the Pacific Northwest. Soon, word of this distant Pacific land reached traders in the east. By 1843, the Hudson's Bay Company had established a trading post under the command of James Douglas, marking the birth of Fort Victoria. For 12 years, Fort Victoria was the center of commerce, where furs, fish, and timber were traded with Indigenous communities. Around it, a small settlement grew. Small clusters of wood houses and cabins were built to house families. The settlement laid the foundations of what would become the city of Victoria, establishing small businesses, a school, and a church. Today, reminders of this early era still stand, such as St. Anne's Schoolhouse, built in 1844, and the Helmkin House, built in 1852. These photographs from 1859 capture the early development of Fort Victoria and the initial buildings that surround the fort, including James Douglas's house, which no longer stands today. Section 3. Gold Fever. On a fateful spring day, April 25, 1858, everything changed. A steamship from San Francisco arrived, carrying over 350 gold prospectors. They were the first of thousands drawn to Victoria as rumors spread about gold in the Fraser Valley. Victoria became the stepping stone from the west coast of the United States to British Columbia's mainland. What was once a quiet outpost, Fort Victoria suddenly grew from a town of 500 to 4,000 residents within a couple of months. Saloons, hotels, and trading posts sprang up overnight to meet the demands of sailors, miners, and loggers that passed through the city, transforming the settlement into a boom town. Investors and merchants arrived, and soon outlines of modern Victoria began to take shape. The building boom in 1860 laid the foundations for Victoria's downtown. The Victoria Windsor Hotel, Webster & Co. building, and commercial warehouses are all examples of this. Section 4. Victoria transformed into a city. With more money flowing through the city, Victoria built its first real hospital in 1858 and the original colonial government buildings in 1860. Nicknamed the bird cages because of their similarity to Chinese pagodas, the government buildings served as a home for BC's Legislative Council and government. Later, Fort Victoria was demolished, and Victoria was officially incorporated in 1864, making it more of a city than a trading port. The bird cages were not the extent of Chinese influence in Victoria. Along with the arrival of Americans, Chinese immigrants also traveled to Victoria from San Francisco in the 1860s. Chinese immigrants were often recruited as laborers from wealthy American merchants, sent to pan for gold in the Fraser Valley. Many Chinese families set up homes and stores in Victoria, setting the foundations of Victoria's Chinatown, the oldest in Canada. Chinese Canadians made up just 300 out of the 5,000-person population in Victoria. Yet they still established a thriving community with theaters, temples, stores, factories, a hospital, and so much more, expanding their neighborhood to up to 6 blocks of Victoria's urban center. The city continued to grow. By 1868, it was the capital of British Columbia, and it continued to expand its boundaries in 1876. Increased wealth in the city is reflected in the larger and more stately architecture of homes and buildings in the area, as we can see in these photographs. Section 5. Completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway. After 4 years of construction, the Canadian Pacific Railway was complete. By 1885, Canadians were linked from Montreal to Vancouver. For a time, it seemed Victoria would be the final terminus of the Great Canadian Pacific Railway. However, these plans were scrapped when engineers explained how difficult and expensive it would be to construct a bridge across the Strait of Georgia. As the rest of Canada became more united, Victoria was increasingly isolated from the rest of the country. Vancouver quickly outpaced Victoria, becoming the main port city in British Columbia and taking on much of the shipping and trade in the province. With economic power shifting across the water, Victoria faced a challenge: how to secure its future. The answer was tourism. By the 1890s, the city embraced its beauty, its history, and Old English charm to sell itself to tourists. Public transportation arrived in the form of streetcars, connecting the city center to the less developed farmlands, as we can see in this photograph of Cook Street. And in 1898, a brand new Parliament building, designed by Francis Mawson Rottenbury, was built to accommodate the growing provincial government. The building drew crowds to come and look at the impressive architecture. Section 6. Beautification of Victoria. As the city expanded into the 20th century, it took on a new mission: to become Canada's prime tourist destination, a city of elegance and beauty. The Canadian Pacific Railway bought land in the inner harbor to build a grand hotel, the Empress, welcome travelers from across the nation. Over top of the James Bay mudflats, the CPR created a dam and filled in the flats to create the Government Street Causeway and a new vacant spot in the inner harbor for the Empress Hotel. The city also paved its streets, constructed public gardens, and erected 349 new buildings in a decade-long boom. Tally-hos were also introduced to provide visitors with guides through the new and improved Victoria. The 1920s saw a return to prosperity, with large projects like the Crystal Gardens, which were built as a social and recreational space to entertain new visitors. As the 1920s ended, urban development took a different turn, focusing its development on efficiency and affordability rather than luxury and elegance. The city endured hardship as the Great Depression took a toll on the strength of Victoria's economy, and the Canadian war effort in the Second World War took up much of the city's attention. For these reasons, this video ends with Crystal Gardens as the last of the early development of Victoria. Today, Victoria stands as a city of history and charm, a place where the past and present meet in harmony. From its Indigenous roots to its colonial past, from the gold rush boom to its modern-day elegance, it is interesting to see the remnants of Victoria's history while walking around British Columbia's Garden City.